Welcome to Dissecting the Battleship, Volume 3. I am Wayne Smith. I've been building models for superior models since 1969, having created over 300 masters from which castings are made. This presentation is a follow-up to Volume 2, The Triple Constraint of the Battleship. We will examine and compare the modern battleships of World War II with respect to their speed, firepower, and protection. This is the book I wrote with Bob Sumrall in 2017. It was designed to be sold on museum battleships to explain to the layman what he saw while touring. It uses a lot of his material and has a number of his original pictures and drawings, never before published, some of which will be in this presentation. This presentation is only a portion of the book. It is copyrighted, and copying any images in this presentation is prohibited without the consent of the author. As a reminder from our last session, the single largest constraint was the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, limiting future ships to no more than 35,000 tons in weight and guns no larger than 16 inches in diameter. The triple constraint is the main theory upon which modern project management is founded. One factor is a priority, and at least one of the others must be diminished to fulfill the priority. For any project, I can make it quick, cheap, or good. Pick two, the third always suffers. It's like going to a small restaurant. You can have it good, quick, and cheap. Pick two. If it's good and quick, it won't be cheap. If it's good and cheap, it won't be quick. And if it is quick and cheap, it won't be good. These are the additional constraints for the naval architect, which we reviewed in Volume 2. You end up with three choices for any particular weight of ship. You can make it fast and powerful, but it won't have much armor. That is a battlecruiser, which we will cover in Volume 4. You can make it powerful and well protected, but it will be slow, the classic battleship. You can make it fast and well protected, but it won't be able to sink another battleship. The German Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were examples of this. The drawings on this slide contrast the protection characteristics of German, British, US, and Japanese battleships built in World War II. The blue areas represent oil tanks. Protection against shells and bombs requires armor, while torpedoes require space to absorb the detonation. Successful damage control required massive pumping systems to drain damaged tanks, and the flooding of empty tanks to keep the ship level in the water. Due to the weight of armor, only about 60% of the length of the hull is armored, and then only to an average height of 15 feet, half below and half above the water. The machinery and magazines are contained within this armored citadel. Living spaces and stores are located outside the citadel. Thin armor on the upper deck fused bombs and shells, which then exploded on the main armor deck instead of penetrating it. Note that only the US and the French used sloped internal armor in World War II. The belt armor is normally mounted vertically on the side of the ship to protect buoyancy. Sloped armor, whether completely internal, like Missouri and New Jersey, or external like Yamato, was more difficult to penetrate, and it deflected incoming shells. However, New Jersey's unarmored hull could be damaged by smaller guns such as Speed and her Speed Reduced. Belts mounted internally and tapered to the bottom of the hull prevented damage due to diving shells. The Japanese discovered this with experiments on the battleship Tosa, and specifically designed their shells to take advantage of this phenomena. A shell hits short of the ship, travels underwater, taking it below the armor belt, and pierces the thin torpedo bulkhead. Unlike a torpedo that explodes on contact, the shell pierces deeply into the ship before exploding. The German Bismarck used the same general design perfected in World War I. She was designed for 16,000-yard engagements in the foggy North Sea or North Atlantic, where shells would be coming in at a low angle. Unused by other countries, the unique 145mm upper belt gave her protection against cruiser and destroyer guns, while the sloped armor deck reinforced the heavy side armor. It was virtually impossible to penetrate Bismarck's belt and deck at short range to damage the engines or magazines. However, in a long-range engagement, her thin 80mm main deck would be pierced by shells such as the New Jersey's. This deck was one level lower than US or British designs, giving less armored volume. Anti-torpedo protection consisted of an outer void to vent the explosion, with the oil tanks catching any splinters from the hull. The thick 45mm torpedo bulkhead, placed far from the side, would protect her engines and magazines. Visiting naval constructors, armed with knowledge of the latest Italian and US techniques, were surprised at this obsolescent scheme. It was effective against a 550-pound warhead. In general, the Bismarck was designed to carry out commerce raiding without being able to be damaged by destroyer or cruiser fire, and if confronted by other battleships, could use her speed to decline action. Like the Bismarck, the British KGV, the King George V class, was designed for 16,000-yard engagements in low visibility weather. The belt was thicker than the German or American designs and was hung on the hull, maximizing protection to the vitals. It was also 24 feet deep, much more than the other ships. The deck was the same thickness as the Missouri, but she did not have the armored upper deck to fuse the bomb or shells. Moreover, KG-5 was designed to be proof against torpedoes, with 1,000-pound warheads, the most of any battleship. The Prince of Wales, KG-5's sister, fought against the Bismarck and was hit by a shell that dove under her armor. That is the black shell in the drawing. It penetrated the POW's outer anti-torpedo defenses and came to rest against her torpedo bulkhead, where it was found while she was being repaired. In summary, with the KGVs, the British deliberately chose less firepower for greater protection. New Jersey's armored deck was one deck higher than Bismarck, providing more protected space. The outer two tanks were kept full of oil, which buffered the shock of the torpedo explosion and absorbed the splinters from the shattered hull. Two more voids allowed for seepage and protected the engines and magazines against warheads up to 700 pounds. In Bob's book on the Iowa, he noted that 6 torpedo hits had a 90% chance of sinking the Iowa-class ships. New Jersey was specifically designed to hunt down fast battleships and battlecruisers and destroy them before she could be crippled herself. Her protection scheme was unique, and she had a narrow immunity zone against regular 16-inch and smaller shells. In summary, New Jersey was designed for long-range, 30,000-yard engagements in the Pacific. Yamato is well known as the largest battleship ever built. It was 80% larger than the KGV and 40% larger than the Bismarck of New Jersey. Well, this gave her a huge advantage over individual opponents. The Japanese only completed 2 of them compared to 10 US battleships. Her belt and deck armor was thicker than any other ship and was virtually unpenetrable by shells. Yamato's torpedo defense was designed to withstand 660-pound warheads and to absorb 5 torpedo hits on the same side without sinking. The US Mark 13 aerial torpedoes had an equivalent warhead of 900 pounds of TNT, exceeding Yamato's design. Despite having no oil in her voids to stop splinters, sheer size allowed her to absorb 12 torpedo hits before sinking. A significant Japanese achievement was creating turret armor 25 inches thick, beyond US or British capabilities. North Carolina was hit by a single Type 93 torpedo with a 900-pound warhead on September 15, 1942. 3 other torpedoes fired from the same submarine, I-19, hit and sank the carrier Wasp. This diagram is from the official damage report. You can see where the plating has been displaced from its normal location and pushed into that last torpedo bulkhead. The diagram is from that official report. The U.S. defined the 5 keys to underwater protective success as 1. The hull plating must be thin to create the fewest possible splinters that would penetrate the ship. 2. The system must allow for dissipation of the initial explosion. 3. The other layers must absorb and contain the residual energy. 4. Individual bulkheads must not touch the next bulkhead when deformed. And 5. The final bulkhead must remain intact to prevent flooding. So she has 5 bulkheads and 4 tanks. Her torpedo bulkheads held, but 1,000 tons of water was emitted. Single submarine torpedo hits on both the Yamato and Musashi caused 3,000 tons of flooding, upholding American anti-torpedo design features. Note how the drawing shows that hull plating and 3 torpedo bulkheads collapsed on that final torpedo bulkhead, despite the warhead being larger than the torpedo defense design of 700 pounds. The official report stated, "It illustrates the continual competition between weapon effectiveness and ship protection, and the damage was sustained by North Carolina without marked reduction of her fighting ability and was ably handled by the ship." These pictures are of the North Carolina in dry dock. The picture on the left is the hole in the North Carolina. The picture on the right is how the hull plating was split. The damage was repaired in 6 weeks at Pearl Harbor, finishing by mid-November. The Navy concluded that to keep a damaged ship afloat, it was most important to 1. Remove the list by counterflooding on the opposite side. If a ship lists too badly, the guns might not be able to be loaded or lowered enough to train on enemy ships. Buoyancy should be regained by pumping water or liquids on the damaged side overboard, by transferring liquids within the ship, and by removing counterflooding water. 2. Finally, trim removal is important to minimize the bow or stern being lower in the water than design. Removal of lists is of prime importance to prevent capsizing, which afflicted nearly all battleships sunk by torpedoes. If the water reached portholes or reaches the main deck that has air vents near the side of the ship, more water will flood the ship. This is a schematic of the internal compartments of the battleship Prince of Wales. The black shell silhouette is where she was hit below the waterline by a shell from the Bismarck. This diving shell traveled 80 feet through the water and came to rest against the torpedo bulkhead. It did not explode and was found when Prince of Wales was being repaired. It is this hit that convinces me that Hood was sunk by a similar hit that penetrated and exploded in her magazines. Prince of Wales was sent to Singapore by Churchill in the vain hope of discouraging the Japanese from attacking in the Pacific. On December 10th, 1942, Japanese land-based torpedo bombers carrying torpedoes with 700-pound warheads successfully attacked the most modern British battleship only 3 days after Pearl Harbor. The red line is the outer port propeller shaft, the longest shaft in the ship. A single hit on the outer port propeller warped the propeller shaft, which destroyed the watertight integrity of the entire port side of the ship, the blue spaces in the schematic. The many compartments limited flooding, but also caused off-center flooding, listing to the port side. The crew counterflooded the yellow spaces to limit the port listing and to correct her trim aft. This also caused her to be lower in the water than designed. Many crew escaped through the harbor machinery room in orange, which is the center of all electrical distribution, but didn't close the hatches, causing loss of power due to water flowing in. Lack of electrical pumps prevented the removal of enough water to keep her afloat. Despite 4 additional torpedo hits on the starboard side, none of them caused extensive damage. In my opinion, the KG-5 design held up well to those hits. If those had been the only hits, Prince of Wales might have survived. However, the single hit aft caused her to capsize to port and sink. She was the first battleship sunk by aircraft while at sea. This damage was a classic example of an unanticipated series of events leading to an engineering disaster. These drawings contrast the torpedo protection scheme between the Iowa-class battleships and the Japanese Yamato, the lower drawing. The circles are the barbettes for the turrets. Note that Yamato has many more compartments in her. New Jersey alternates her engineering spaces rather than subdivide them. New Jersey in the upper drawing has 18 feet of anti-torpedo bulkheads on each side of the ship. Alternating the engine and boiler rooms stretched across the ship so that if a torpedo penetrated the torpedo bulkheads, water would spread across the ship and limit listing. If a transverse bulkhead was compromised, only one boiler room and one engine room would be affected. Diesel generators were located after the stern turret and forward of boiler room number 1 to supply emergency power. Electricity is required for pumps, radars, and weapons, without which the ship will be overwhelmed and sunk like the Prince of Wales. The two gray outer spaces are filled with fuel oil, and the two voids inside are designed to contain leaks. While Yamato is 20 feet wider than New Jersey to keep her machinery compact and lessen the length of armored space, she still has only the 18 feet of anti-torpedo bulkheads. Her boiler and engine rooms are separated by width instead of length. She carried her oil in the bottom of the ship, meaning there was nothing in her voids to absorb splinters from torpedo hits. While the smaller machinery spaces restricted flooding, they also caused off-center flooding, causing her to list and eventually founder. The voids were not equipped with pumps, which hampered her ability to limit damage. Struck by 12 or 13 torpedoes, all but one on the port side. The blue sections represent flooded spaces, and the yellow is counter-flooding to prevent listing. Despite the Yamato's anti-torpedo protection not being as sophisticated with pumps, sheer size made it effective. Sumrall estimated that 6 hits on a New Jersey had a 90% chance of sinking her. What were the most powerful guns mounted on World War II battleships? The information about shell penetration factor is found in the article Penetration Probabilities by Jose Medina and W.J. Journs in Warship International, June 22. It exhaustively takes into account penetration at different angles, range, and explosive filling. The main factors are shell weight, shell diameter, length of the barrel, and the size of the propellant charge. The letter grade I have given them is my way of grouping and classifying the various Navy's guns. It is not part of the article and is my personal opinion. US, Japanese, and British shells were heavier and fired at a lower velocity. Lower velocity guns did not wear out as quickly. The US invested heavily in shell technology before World War II, while the Japanese invested in torpedo technology. The US shells are heavier for their diameter because they are longer. The Iowa 16-inch 50 guns have a flatter trajectory than the 16-inch 45s on the North Carolina, meaning the shorter barrel would have a higher arc, allowing better deck penetrations at long range. U.S. technology and the size and weight of the Japanese 18-inch guns gave them very similar performance, yielding an A rating, excellent weapons. German guns used lighter shells and higher velocity. This gave them a low trajectory like a modern tank gun. The upgraded World War I guns mounted on the British Vanguard, their last completed battleship, and the French guns were slightly better than Bismarck's, giving all of them a B rating, above average. The Italians tried a high-velocity, heavy shell combination, which rapidly wore out the barrels, making them inaccurate, hence the lowered rating. The British 14-inch gun was not exceptional, but it did help sink 2 German battleships, proving that the best isn't always necessary. These guns rate a C, or an average. Alaska's 12-inch gun was a phenomenal weapon, and almost as powerful as the much larger British 14 and 15-inch guns. It was also expensive, being only fitted to Alaska and Guam. Intended for 6 ships, 3 ships were canceled without being laid down, and one, the Hawaii, was never finished. The Japanese 14-inch gun was mounted on 4 Congos, 2 Fusos, and 2 Isseis. The U.S. 12-inch and Japanese 14-inch would have difficulty scoring penetrating hits on modern battleships. Therefore, I have rated them Ds, below average. This leaves the German 11-inch gun mounted on the pocket battleships and the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Scharnhorst 11-inch shell wouldn't penetrate battleship armor and was a significant factor in her loss to Duke of York, a sister to the King George V and Prince of Wales. They were only effective against cruisers. This rates a failing grade of E. Every ship suffers from these design constraints. These are my 1 to 12 models showing them in scale. Iowa traded suspect torpedo protection and heavy weather handling for excellent firepower, good protection, and speed. You can visit all 4 of the Iowas in New Jersey, Virginia, California, and Hawaii. North Carolina was well armed but slightly slower than her contemporaries and was armored to stop 14-inch shells. You can visit her in Wilmington, North Carolina. South Dakota was well armed and armored, but very cramped. You can visit her sister ships, Alabama and Mobile, and Massachusetts and Fore River. You can also visit South Dakota's Memorial in Sioux Falls. It has a beautiful model of the engine room, and that is worth the visit alone. The massive Japanese Yamato was well armed and armored, but had inferior torpedo protection and was slower than desired. Bismarck was fast with a relatively well-armored hull, but had inadequate firepower and poorly protected turrets. If you want it all, the ship must be very large and very expensive. In general, for the price of a very large ship, 2 adequate ships could be built, which have a better chance of winning the engagement. Here are 5 of the modern battleships built by the US, Germany, Britain, Japan, and Italy. The number in the class is in parentheses. The Bismarck, KG-Fee, and Littorio are the original recognition models from World War II, but they have been highly detailed since then. Anatomically, they were good models. USS Missouri was the last battleship completed by the US Navy. Only the US did not lose a modern battleship in combat. Legendary Bismarck sank Hood in May 1941, but was overwhelmed by superior forces after being fatally damaged by an aerial torpedo. The torpedo jammed her rudders, meaning she could no longer steer. She was sunk by the KG-5 and Rodney and cruiser torpedoes. Torpedoes were responsible for almost all battleships sunk in World War II. The British completed 5 KG-5 class battleships. These ships have been considered the weakest of the treaty battleships, but paradoxically had the best exploits. Prince of Wales, companion to the legendary Hood, inflicted 2 critical hits on Bismarck. One penetrated Bismarck's bow at the waterline, cutting off access to 1,000 tons of oil, and lower in the water at the bow, limiting her speed. King George V, with battleship Rodney, was responsible for sinking Bismarck 3 days later. Another sister Duke of York scored at least 13 hits on the German battleship Scharnhorst in December 1943. These slowed the Scharnhorst and disabled her forward armament, allowing her to be caught and sunk by destroyer torpedoes. POW was the first battleship sunk by aircraft, land-based aircraft. The Japanese Yamato and Musashi were the largest and most powerful battleships ever constructed. Musashi was the first battleship sunk by carrier aircraft in 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Yamato was sunk by carrier aircraft in April 1945 at Okinawa. This was late in the war for carrier aircraft to be finally effective against battleships. In World War II, there were actually more battleship engagements, 11, most in the Atlantic, than aircraft carrier battles, of which there were only 5. 4 of those in 1942 and the last in 1944. The Littorios were not well known, but were well-balanced ships. Littorio's sister Vittorio Veneto survived a single torpedo hit to her stern, shearing off her port propeller like the Prince of Wales and allowing 4,000 tons of flooding. Her design of widely separating her screws and rudders allowed her crew to repair damage and return home, unlike the Bismarck. Third sister Roma was sunk on September 9, 1943 by two Fritz X radio-controlled bombs, which were guided by the bombardiers into the battleship. They detonated her powder magazine. More than the loss of Musashi and Yamato to carrier-based aircraft, the sinking of Roma by primitive guided missiles signaled the end of the battleship era. These ratings are a framework to discuss the virtues and shortcomings of each ship. Turquoise are the outstanding characteristics of the ships. Yellows are a close second. Red is a critical weakness. The fire control ratings and protection ratings are the author's opinion. The 2 North Carolina, 4 South Dakota, and 5 King George V's all were built under the Washington Naval Treaty constraints of 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns. When Japan left the treaty and refused to release details about their new ships, the French, Britain, and U.S. agreed to a 45,000-ton limit. The Germans and Italians built their ships to meet their military requirements and ignored the treaty. The triple constraint reflects which of the 3 constraints was the driver for that particular ship. Note that each ship has a different order of priorities when building the ship. The triple constraint means that no ship is well rated for guns, fire control, speed, and protection. Each nation had a different vision and plan for how to use its ships. The ships with the best armament were the Yamato and the U.S. New Jersey class of battleships. The Yamato had greatest shell size, while the U.S. maximized the potential of a smaller barrel. Perhaps more importantly, the U.S. and British radar fire control systems were far superior to their opponents, particularly by the end of the war. While Japanese optical fire control was excellent, it has only been many years after the war that Yamato is credited with hitting the escort carrier Gambier Bay. The British 14-inch shell was pedestrian, while the Italian guns were inaccurate. The best armored ship was Yamato due to her sheer size. Surprisingly, the British KGV is extremely well armored due to the British making the toughest armor plate in the world. After the war, tests showed that British armor was equal to U.S. armor 25% thicker. Now, ironically, some of the early designs of the KG-5 had thinner armor and 15-inch guns, a better all-around ship. This is not what the British built, however. Littorio had armor that barely extended below the waterline, exposing her hull when she rolled. Bismarck wasted weight on the upper 6-inch belt, designed to protect her from cruiser and destroyer fire. The U.S. armor schemes were innovative, but the torpedo defense system was not built to withstand the unknown Japanese Type 93 torpedoes with 1,080-pound warheads. Nevertheless, North Carolina shrugged off her torpedo hit with less damage and flooding than Bismarck's, Veneto's, or Yamato's single hits. The Iowa class wins the speed competition hands down. The Germans and Italians both designed fast battleships so they could force or evade battles. Despite their smaller guns, 3 King George V's engaged and sank 2 German battleships. No other country's battleships matched those exploits. The final constraint is always financial. When you compare the cost of ships, the U.S. ships appear much more expensive than the British, German, or Japanese ships. Starting with displacement, note that King George V, North Carolina, and South Dakota were designed to the 35,000-ton limit. Bismarck is nearly the size of New Jersey. Yamato stands alone at 64,000 tons. The costs were from Heinrich's book, Warship Builders. At $35 million, King George V appears to be one half of the $76 million cost of the comparable North Carolina and South Dakota. Can you really purchase 2 Yamatos or 2 Bismarcks or almost 3 King George V's for the price of 1 Iowa? Hidden but real costs are in the 4 notes on the slide. Riveting consumed precious weight in treaty-limited ships. The U.S. had to build ships with features that allowed them to be at sea for long times due to the distance in the Pacific from bases. Germany and Japan had to spend extra money just to build the ships. However, when compared to percentage of GDP, the U.S. ships were comparatively cheap, mostly because the U.S. GDP was almost 5 times the size of Japan's and 3 times that of Germany's and Britain's. When taking GDP into account, the King George V and Bismarck were about the same cost as an Iowa, but did not solve the triple constraint as well as she did. The Yamato's comparative cost was staggering, being twice that of Iowa. In fact, the Japanese could not afford to build those ships. The U.S. Navy was fortunate that the Japanese did not build more carriers or destroyers with long-range torpedoes. The U.S. spent $1 billion on 10 battleships and 2 large cruisers, compared to spending $2 billion to build the atomic bomb and $3 billion on the B-29 program. The U.S. won World War II due to its economic power and industrial capacity, allowing it to substitute an overwhelming number of good machines to preserve lives. The resurgence of the battleship occurred in the 1980s. The Russians built several large cruisers in the 1970s, each mounting 20 long-range anti-ship missiles. Under President Reagan, all 4 Iowa-class battleships were recommissioned and rearmed with 32 Tomahawk land attack and 16 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, while retaining the 16-inch guns and 12 5-inch guns. Missouri and Wisconsin performed combat duties in Desert Storm in 1991 and were then decommissioned, the last of the battleships. Unless hit by a torpedo under the hull or a nuclear warhead, no modern weapons exist that could penetrate her armor. The Iowa's obsolescence was a virtue. If that's true, why is the battleship no longer viable? The battleship is nearly invincible for a 20-mile radius. Just as in World War II, when aircraft carriers replaced battleships because planes had a range of 200 miles compared to the 20 miles of the battleship, missiles provide that capability today. They require at least 1,600 crew members. Missiles can be launched with far more accuracy from farther away by new, less costly ships with far smaller crews. Even if they don't sink the battleship, they will destroy her fire control, missile guidance, and wreak havoc among the 5-inch mounts and box launchers, making her combat ineffective. The last use of battleships was in Desert Storm in 1991 with complete air superiority. This is Wayne Smith, and it's been my pleasure to present some of Bob's and my book to you. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Our next presentation will be on the confusing state of battlecruisers in World War II compared to their World War I counterparts. Volume 4 will answer the question, was the Alaska a battlecruiser? If you have any suggestions for other penetrations about warships, or would like to purchase any of the models used in the presentation, please contact Navco. Please share, subscribe, and like this site. Signing off for now, and thank you for being here.